Picture a man alone at the edge of the Arizona Territory. The sun is going flat and red behind the Dragoon Mountains, and somewhere out in the dark, a child is crying. Caleb Hartley had not spoken a word to another human being in 11 days, but that sound cut through the still evening air, and he was already moving before he knew why. He found her crouched against a boulder, a small girl of about 6, arms wrapped around her knees, and a lean, gray wolf circling not 10 feet away. He did not shout. He did not rush. He stepped slow, put himself between the animal and the child, raised the rifle, and fired once. The report rolled off the dragoons, and the wolf dropped. The girl did not run. She just stared at him, with the darkest, most serious eyes he had ever seen on a child that age. He had no idea then what the next morning would bring. No idea that before the sun got very high, a young Chiricahua Apache woman would ride out of those same mountains and stop at his gate, and that from that moment his life would never quite sit the way it had before. Her name was Naiche, and she had something to say about the life he had just saved. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and like the video. Stay for the whole story. It is worth it. The winter of 1878 came early to that stretch of the Arizona Territory. The high country above the Dragoon Mountains was already locked under snow by the second week of November, and down in the valley the mornings came gray and bitter, the frost so hard it turned the brown grass to glass underfoot. A cold wind pushed in from the north and stayed there. Caleb Hartley's ranch sat about 6 miles east of Benson, far enough that the church bells on Sunday mornings never quite reached him, far enough that nobody rode out without a reason. He had built the place himself 4 years back, when his wife Sarah was still alive. They had talked late into many nights about what they were building toward: a herd, a garden, a house with a proper floor. Sarah had come from Virginia, and she had an opinion about floors. She had opinions about most things, and Caleb had loved her for every one of them. She died in the spring of 1876. Fever took her fast, 6 days from the first chill to the end. Their son had been born too early and too small and followed her within the week. Caleb buried them both on the low rise behind the house, under 2 big cottonwood trees that had already been there when he arrived, already large and permanent, as if the land had known what that ground would be needed for. After that he ran the ranch the way you run a machine you are not particularly attached to. Up early, horses fed, fence line walked, water hauled, whatever was broken fixed. He ate alone and slept alone, and in the evenings sat by the fire without doing much of anything. The 2 hands he'd hired the summer before drifted off, one and then the other, the way men do when the grief in a place is too heavy to work around. He didn't blame them. Grief like that has its own gravity. It bends the air around it and makes it hard for people to stand upright nearby. He'd had one exchange in Benson the previous month that he still turned over sometimes. Tom Wicks from the feed store put a hand on his shoulder and said something about time healing things. Caleb had nodded in the right places, ridden home, and sat in the empty house for an hour staring at the wall. Time was not healing anything. Time was just moving. He knew the difference even if he didn't say it out loud to anyone. He didn't mind the solitude, or if he did, he'd buried that opinion with the others. That November evening he was at the fire mending a saddle strap when he heard the sound, a child's cry, thin and high, from the direction of the east fence. He listened for a moment, decided it was real, pulled on his coat, took the rifle from the hook, and went out. The stars were out the way they get at altitude in winter, dense and cold, and the dragoons were just a black ridge against the sky, an outline he knew by now, the way you know the shape of a hand you've held. The girl, Sante, was Apache, 6 years old, small even for that, coal black braids, a wool blanket wrapped around her, that was doing nothing much against the cold. She must have wandered 2 or 3 miles from wherever she'd started. The wolf had followed her smell, patient as wolves are. Caleb shot the wolf, stood there until his heart settled, then crouched down in front of the girl. He did not reach for her, he just waited. After a moment she looked up at him, studying his face the way children study things they haven't worked out yet. He had a face that wasn't soft, exactly, but not hard in the way that frightens children. Just a face that had been outside a lot. He pointed at himself. "Caleb," he said. She said nothing, but she stopped shaking. He carried her back to the house on his back because the night had turned bitter, and her moccasins weren't made for frost. He heated the last of the morning's cornmeal, and she ate all of it in silence, watching the fire. He spread a blanket for her near the hearth and sat in the chair across from her. At some point in the middle of the night, she curled on her side and closed her eyes. He didn't sleep much. He sat by the dying fire and thought about the strangeness of it. 11 days of silence, then a 6-year-old Apache girl asleep on his floor, a dead wolf by the east fence, and no clear idea what came next. He wondered if there was family somewhere, someone spending the night out of their mind with worry. He was still thinking about it when the sun came up. She was already sitting straight when he opened his eyes, watching the door. He put wood on the fire, put coffee on, and tried to figure out how to ask a child, in a language he didn't speak, who she belonged to. He was part way through some useless hand gestures when he heard it. Hoof beats from the northeast, fast. He stepped onto the porch. The rider was a young woman. Chiricahua, from the cut of her dress and the beadwork along the front. Geometric diamonds in deep red and white, the kind of close work that takes a long winter to finish. She rode the way people ride, who learned before they could do much else, and she pulled up at the gate with the horse still moving, one hand already on the saddle horn, reading him before he'd had time to open his mouth. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Sante appeared in the doorway behind him and said something sharp and relieved in their language, and the young woman's whole face changed. It went from guarded and careful to something softer and harder to name, the look of someone who has been frightened a long time and is only now letting herself believe the bad thing didn't happen. She dismounted. She came to the gate. "You kept her safe," she said. Her English was careful and deliberate, chosen the way someone chooses words when they learned a language by listening at trading posts rather than from any schoolroom. "She needed keeping," Caleb said. Her name was Naiche. She explained over the next few minutes that Sante was her younger sister. Their parents had been dead 2 years. Naiche had been caring for Sante alone since then, living at the margins of what remained of their band after the fighting had pushed the people into hard country. Their band had once moved freely through the Dragoon Mountains and the Chiricahua Range to the east. Now they moved carefully, in smaller numbers, keeping clear of the army patrols, trying to hold on to what was left. Sante had slipped away the afternoon before, while Naiche was gathering wood. She had searched until dark. Then she had searched through the dark. The night had been the worst of her life. She stood very straight while she said all of this. There was no performance in it. She was telling him what was true. Then she said something else. There was a law among her people about a life saved. When someone pulls a person you love from death, the debt is not a small thing. You don't settle it with a coin or a trade. By the custom she had grown up with, she owed him a service. She would keep his house, tend the animals, and be useful to him until, in an accounting only she would know, the debt was answered. Caleb looked at the child in the doorway, then back at her. "I'm not looking for a debt paid," he said. "I just shot a wolf." "I know what you did," Naiche said. "I know why you did it. That does not change what I owe. He tried 2 more objections. She waited through both of them, patient in the way of someone who has already made up her mind. Finally he looked up at the sky, the color of lead, promising snow before midday, and thought about the practical problem of a woman and a child in the open with a storm coming. He also thought, though he wouldn't have admitted it, that the house had been very quiet for a long time. "You can stay until the weather breaks," he said. "We'll talk about the rest after." They did not talk about the rest for quite some time. The first few days were careful. Everyone moved around everyone else the way you move through a dark room with furniture you don't know yet. Caleb ate at the same end of the table he always sat at. Naiche cooked on the fire without asking permission, using dried beans and salt pork from the larder and something from her own pack, dried herbs, a pouch of cornmeal, ground finer than anything you could get in Benson. The food was better than anything he'd made for himself in 2 years. He didn't say so, but he ate every bit. Sante was a different matter. She wasn't shy by nature, only by circumstance, and within 2 days she had decided Caleb was someone worth investigating. She followed him to the barn each morning and watched him with the horses with great seriousness. One morning he turned around to find her trying to imitate the way he pitched hay, using a stick a fraction of the size of his pitchfork, scattering very small amounts of straw with enormous effort and a look of total concentration. He laughed. It surprised him so much, he just stood there for a moment, listening to the sound, which felt strange coming out of him, like a door he'd forgotten was in the wall. Naiche heard it from the house. She was at the window washing dishes when it came to her through the cold morning air, and she stopped what she was doing and stood there until the sound ended. He started teaching Sante English words for the things in the barn: saddle, bridle, harness, hay, water trough, each horse's name. She taught him the words back in their language with great seriousness, correcting his pronunciation with a directness that made Naiche have to leave the room on more than one occasion, so she could stand in the kitchen doorway and press her lips together. On the 4th or 5th evening, the days blurred a little, as snow began to fall in earnest, and the world outside the windows went white and muffled. Naiche sat down at the table while Caleb was drinking his after-dinner coffee, and said, without preamble, that she wanted to know what he planted in the spring. He told her. She asked about the soil on the east side, whether it drained well, whether he'd had trouble with the squash. He had, actually. She told him why, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been watching how land behaves their whole life. He listened. They talked about the garden for an hour, and when it was over he realized it was the first real conversation he'd had with another person since summer. He went to bed with something unfamiliar in his chest, something that took him a few minutes to identify. Anticipation. He was looking forward to tomorrow. That was new. One evening at the end of the first week, he came in from the cold and found her by the fire, braiding Sante's hair and singing something quiet. The song was low and repetitive, a few notes cycling back on themselves. It took him a moment to understand it was a lullaby. Something their mother had sung, probably. She sang it the way you sing, something taught to you by someone who is gone, carefully, holding every small turn of it, not letting any part drift. He took his boots off and sat down and didn't interrupt. Sante was already half asleep, the serious little face completely relaxed, her hands open in her lap. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the books of lullabies she'd brought from Virginia, the ones she'd marked up in her neat, slanted handwriting. Naiche glanced up and caught his expression, and whatever she saw there made her not look away right away. They held that for a moment, something passing between them that didn't need words, that neither of them was ready to name. After Sante was fully asleep, Naiche stood and said quietly, "She lost our mother's voice. I try to remember it exactly." "You do a good job," Caleb said. "I do not know if that is true. I was not much older than she is when our mother died." He looked at her. She was standing in the firelight with her arms at her sides, and she looked neither young nor old just then, just a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten used to the weight of it. "I lost someone too," he said. 2 years back, my wife, our boy." She was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said. Just that, and the way she said it was the way you say something you actually mean. He nodded. They stood there in the firelight for a while without speaking, and it wasn't uncomfortable. The fire settled. Outside the snow had stopped, and the night was very still. He could hear the cottonwoods on the rise, the sound the wind made through them, a sound that had been painful to him for 2 years. He noticed he wasn't finding it painful right now. He wasn't sure what had changed. About halfway through this story, I want to ask you something. If you've ever lost someone and spent weeks, maybe months, just going through the motions of a day because that was all there was left to do, leave a comment below. Just say, "I kept going." That's all. I read everyone. Winter settled hard after that first week. The snow came in waves, a few days white, then a brief thaw, then more snow, closing the roads for stretches of 2 and 3 weeks. Caleb had provisioned for 1 man through a hard winter. He hadn't counted on 3, but the stores held if they were careful, and Naiche was careful in ways he had never been with his own provisions. She stretched things, combined things, turned almost nothing into something. One afternoon she found a sack of dried corn he'd pushed to the back of the larder, and mostly forgotten, and by evening it was a stew that Sante declared, with absolute authority, was the best thing she had ever eaten. He started watching Naiche work without quite admitting to himself that he was doing it. The way she moved had an economy to it, nothing wasted, everything placed exactly where it needed to go. She had a habit of humming under her breath while she cooked, just a fragment of a melody, stopping and starting. She didn't seem to know she was doing it. He didn't say anything. It felt like something that would stop if he pointed at it. Some mornings, she wore her hair loose before braiding it for the day. One morning he came in from the barn earlier than usual, and she was standing by the window, brushing it out, the winter light behind her, her back to him. He stopped in the doorway for just a moment before he cleared his throat, and she turned around. And he said something about breakfast, and she said something back, and they both pretended the moment had been ordinary. He fixed fence, he hauled wood, he taught her how to work the pump when the handle was stiff with cold, which was most mornings now. She taught him, in return, how to read certain signs in the sky above the dragoons that meant weather was coming faster than the clouds would suggest. He started paying attention to those signs and found they were more reliable than what he'd been watching before. She knew this ground at a depth he was still only beginning to reach, even after 4 years of living on it. One afternoon in mid-December, during a brief thaw, she asked him to take her to the South Ridge. She wanted to see the old trail the Chiricahua used when the dragoons were still free-range. He saddled 2 horses, and they rode mostly in silence, the ground crunching under the hooves, their breath coming out in white puffs. There was a cedar smell to the air up here that didn't reach the valley, and the sky was the kind of hard winter blue that made the mountains look close enough to touch. When they reached the ridge, she stood looking east at the mountains for a long time, without speaking. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He had learned by then that she would say it when she was ready, and that waiting with her wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was, in fact, one of the things he had come to count on, the way she was never in a hurry to fill silence. "My father brought me here when I was 8, she said. He showed me every peak, the names they had before. He said knowing the names was the first way of belonging to a place. What did he call the high one? Caleb said, meaning the tall peak to the south. She told him. It wasn't a short name. He tried to say it. She corrected him twice. On the third attempt, she said nothing, which he had learned meant he'd gotten it close enough. I'll practice, he said. Yes, she said. Something in her voice was not quite a smile, warmth that didn't quite reach the surface. He stood there beside her for a while longer, looking at the same mountains she was looking at, and thought about what it meant to have a name for something. The way it changed your claim on a place, or the place's claim on you. He had lived here 4 years, and didn't know the old names for anything. They rode back to the ranch, as the light went copper on the Dragoon rock faces, and Sante ran out to the gate to report that one of the barn cats had knocked over a full pail of water, and she had cleaned most of it up. Life had a rhythm now. He had almost stopped noticing. It was unusual. One evening in January, the rhythm broke. Naiche came back from a walk to the east fence, with her jaw set and her eyes flat. She told him, without any let-up, that 2 men had ridden to the fence that afternoon and watched her for a while and said things she didn't repeat. She said it the way someone gives a report, not asking for anything. She had decided he should know what was out there. He asked her to describe the men. She described them. A stocky man in a brown coat with red-veined cheeks, another on a bay horse with a red bandana at his neck, both wearing the kind of expression men wear when they think they are entitled to look at whatever they like. He knew who they were, Jed Carver and his partner Ike. They'd been working the territory for about a year, and what Caleb had heard about them in Benson was said in low voices. They collected government scrip for information on Apache movements, and they weren't careful about how they got it. A man named Tilson, who ran the livery, had mentioned, very quietly one afternoon, while saddling Caleb's horse, that Carver and Ike had delivered a woman and a teenage boy to Fort Grant the previous spring, and that the way they'd done it hadn't sat right with people who saw it. Tilson had said this at the horse, not at Caleb. Just put it out there and let it land. They won't come onto the property, Caleb said. Naiche looked at him with the expression she used when he said something technically possible, but not connected to reality. You believe that, she said. I have a rifle. Yes, she said. And they will wait until you are somewhere. The rifle is not. She was right, and he knew it. He spent 3 days after that thinking about it at odd moments, while he fed the horses, over supper, lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind off the mountains. Carver and Ike were bounty hunters of the worst kind, and what they had seen on his land was an Apache woman and a child. Those 2 would fetch them scrip if they could reach them while he wasn't watching. He thought it through. Taking Naiche and Sante into Benson wasn't a real option. Benson hadn't distinguished itself by treating the Apache with much dignity, and beyond that, Naiche had given no sign she was going to be moved at the direction of a threat. He respected that. Something in him also resisted it on other grounds. It felt wrong to have her running because of men like Carver. He chose to be watchful. He took the rifle to the barn. He stopped leaving the property for long. He checked the east fence twice a day and told Naiche what he was doing and why, because she deserved to know. She listened, and then told him she was already doing her own watching and had been since the morning after those men first appeared at the fence. Of course she had. February came, on a Tuesday morning in the second week, when the sky was hard and blue and the air bit at the back of your throat. 4 riders came through the east gate. Carver and Ike, and 2 others he didn't know. They came with the casual confidence of people who had been planning their moment, and had finally decided it had arrived. Caleb was at the barn. He heard the horses and walked out into the yard, rifle in hand. "Morning, Hartley," Carver said. He was sitting easy, both hands on the saddle horn. "Heard you've been keeping some Apache on your land. We've come to clarify the situation." "The situation's clear to me," Caleb said. "I don't think it is. There are territorial arrangements about Apache out of their allotted area. We're here as a courtesy." "I know what you're here for," Caleb said. He put himself in the middle of the yard and did the math. 4 men on horseback, 1 man on foot. The math was not good. "Last chance to be sensible," Carver said. Something had gone out of his voice. The arrow came from the left. It came from the gap between the barn and the tool shed, and it took Ike's hat clean off his head. Ike's horse shied hard to the right, and he grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, barely staying on. Before anyone moved, a second arrow hit the gatepost, a foot from the third rider's knee, and that horse went sideways in 3 fast steps. Naiche stepped out from behind the shed, third arrow already knocked. She walked into the open ground between Caleb and the riders and set her feet, the bow at full draw, aimed at Carver's chest. She had put herself where Caleb couldn't be flanked. "Go," she said. Carver stared at her. He was looking for the weakness in it, the woman with the bow, the man with the rifle, 2 spooked horses, 2 partners no longer fully attending to the work. He looked for the thing that would break. Naiche's arms didn't shake, her face didn't change. Caleb jacked the rifle. Carver looked at Caleb, then back at Naiche, then at the man on the bay horse who was still fighting to get the animal still. He made his calculation. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Caleb said. "Ride." They rode. The sound of them faded back through the east gate and out across the valley floor, and for a moment, Caleb and Naiche stood in the yard listening to it go. He let out a breath and lowered the rifle. She lowered the bow, but didn't put the arrow away, not yet. She was still watching where they had gone. After a moment, Sante appeared in the doorway. She had stayed inside, which meant Naiche had told her to before any of this started, which meant Naiche had known it was coming, before Caleb heard the horses. She had moved into position at the barn, before they even rode through the gate. He walked over to her. "You had the bow in the barn," he said. "Since last week," she said. "I moved it yesterday when I saw fresh tracks at the east fence." He nodded slowly. He was thinking about who Naiche was. The woman who had ridden out of the Dragoons to honor a debt that he hadn't agreed was owed. The woman who'd mended his coat with invisible stitches and sung lullabies in a language he was slowly learning and taught him to read weather in the sky. Who had just walked into an open yard, in full view of 4 armed men, with nothing between her and them but her own steadiness and 3 arrows. "You could have stayed inside," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I could not have." He thought about that. It was the same reasoning as coming out to help with the fence without being asked. The logic of someone who doesn't perform care, but simply acts on it. The same way he had put himself between the wolf and her sister without stopping to think about it. You don't stay inside when the people you care about are standing in an open yard. You can't. It isn't possible. Sante came running across the yard and buried her face against his coat, both arms tight around him, and he put his hand on her back without thinking about it, and held on. Naiche watched the 2 of them. Her face had something in it he hadn't seen before. Not grief, not the careful guardedness of those first weeks. Something that had arrived at a decision. He stood there in the yard for a while after, not moving. The cold was sharp, and the sky was very blue, and the only sound was wind and the horses breathing. He thought about how strange it was that a moment like that, 4 men on horseback, 2 arrows, a standoff, could feel, on the other side of it, like something clarifying, like something settling into its right shape. He had put himself in the yard because he would not let them take her, She had put herself in the yard because she would not let them take him. That was the whole thing, right there. No debt, no custom, no arrangement. Just two people who had decided, without discussing it, where they were going to stand. In the days after, Caleb sent a letter to the county sheriff through a rider heading to Benson, with enough specifics about Carver and Ike's methods that staying in that stretch of territory became inconvenient for them. A month later, Tom Wicks at the feed store mentioned they'd moved north, toward the Verde Valley. Caleb didn't lose any sleep over it. The winter broke slowly, the way Arizona winters do. One warm afternoon, then cold again, then 3 warm days, then cold once more. But lighter now, the worst of it gone from the air. The mornings came later, and the evenings came slower. One morning he went to the barn and found one of the mares had foaled overnight. The foal was already on its feet, dark brown and unsteady, and the mare was cleaning its face with the patient thoroughness of someone who has decided this is the most important job there is. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, just taking it in, and then went back and knocked on the house door. Naiche and Sante both came out in their coats. Sante pressed herself against the stall boards and went very still, barely breathing, watching the foal try to figure out how its legs worked. She did not say anything. That was how you knew it had gotten through to her. She went quiet. He saw Naiche's face in that moment and thought, I want to remember exactly that, just pure gladness. No grief in it, no caution. She had forgotten for those few minutes to be careful about what she let show. They were sitting by the fire one evening in late February, a warm day having left the window cracked a little, and through it, you could just barely hear something that sounded like spring, deciding to show up early. Sante was asleep, worn out from an afternoon spent chasing barn cats with a length of rope she had decided was a lasso. The fire was low, Naiche said without looking up from the beadwork in her hands, the red and white diamond pattern she had been working for weeks. I think the debt is answered. He went still. She looked up. Her face was calm. I have kept your house. I have been useful to you. I think it is answered. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire shifted with a small sound. You're not being useful when you patch the fence or clean Sante's dress, he said. You're not being useful when you sit up late talking about the mountains, or tell me what your father called the peaks in your language, or tell me what season it is by the smell of the air. He stopped and sorted his words. That's not a debt. That's just a life. She was watching him. What is it then? She said. Not quite a question, just the direct way she said things that mattered to her. He sat forward, elbows on his knees. I don't have the right word for all of it, he said. But I know this house has been a house again since you two got here. I laugh now. I wake up wanting to come to breakfast instead of just needing to eat. I'm at the north fence and I wonder what you're doing at the house and when you're going to come out and tell me I'm doing something wrong. He stopped. I'd be a fool to let you go over a debt I never agreed was owed. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods on the rise. The sound that had been painful to him for 2 years. He was listening to it, and it wasn't painful right now. Naiche was quiet. Her hands had gone still on the beadwork. My people have been pushed far from where we lived, she said. There are those in my band who would say I should not be here, that I am giving something away by staying on a white man's land. A pause. I have thought about that. And? I have decided I'm living my own life, she said. Not the life other people say it should be. She looked at him. Sante belongs here now. The horses, the mountains, the garden she has already decided we are planting in April. This place is hers. A pause. It is mine too. He nodded. His throat was tighter than he expected. Do you want to stay? He said. Just that. The plainest version. She looked at him with the steady, unhurried gaze she used when she was answering something she was certain about. "Yes," she said. He reached across and took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the beadwork. He didn't do much more than that. He just held it, her hand in his, in the firelight, while outside the cottonwoods moved in the early spring wind. She let him. She curled her fingers around his. They sat there without speaking for a while. And the fire did what fires do, and outside the dark wasn't as cold as it had been. The weeks after were quiet, in a good way. Naiche began to unpack things she had kept in her saddlebag since November. A pouch of cedar, a carved comb, a folded piece of cloth worked in her mother's pattern, red and white. She set them on the shelf beside the window that got the morning light. Caleb moved a bridle that had been sitting in the corner of the bedroom for 8 months and felt, in some way he couldn't have explained, that something had been put right. They talked about spring, cattle to buy and restock the herd, new fence posts for the north section, the garden that Sante had already issued a full set of plans for, with the certainty of a person who considers the matter settled and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. One Sunday in March, Caleb rode into Benson and came back with a piece of paper and a man named Reverend Tolliver, small gray beard, coat that was either very old or very well traveled. Naiche met him at the door with a level look. He met it with a respectful nod. Not much needed to be said beyond that. It was a small ceremony. Sante stood between them and held both their hands, which hadn't been part of any plan, but turned out to be better than the plan. Tolliver read some words. Caleb said what needed to be said, and Naiche said it back to him, first in English and then in their own language. And he suspected the second version reached places the first one didn't quite get to. When it was done, Sante looked up at both of them with the pure confidence of a 6-year-old who has decided something is exactly right. "Good," she said. Naiche looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Naiche. They both laughed at the same moment, together, and the sound went out through the open door into the clear March morning, into the yard, past the gate, out toward the Dragoons where all of this had started. It was the first of many springs. Not easy ones exactly. The territory was hard ground to build a life on, and there were people in Benson who didn't extend warmth their direction, and the government had opinions about Apache land rights that kept Naiche's jaw tight and Caleb's temper short more than once over the years. But Sante grew up with both a ranch and a language. She grew up knowing the Dragoon Mountains the way her grandfather had known them, their names, their moods, which way the weather came off each ridge. She could pitch hay, beat a diamond pattern, ride a horse, and name every peak in sight in 2 languages. She knew which signs in the sky meant weather arriving faster than the clouds suggested, because her sister had taught her. And on winter evenings, long after the ranch had grown and changed and grown again, Naiche would sometimes hum that lullaby their mother had sung, just those few notes, cycling back on themselves. Quiet, careful, not letting any part of it slip. Caleb would stop what he was doing and listen. He never got tired of that sound. He figured he never would. Thank you for spending this evening with this story. If it moved you, share it with someone who could use a quiet hour. Like the video, leave a comment, and we will see you at the next one.